Spring came to Mauthausen in 1943, not as a promise of renewal, but as a cruel mockery of hope. The snow had melted from the rocky slopes, revealing cracked gray earth, soaked not with rain, but with blood and ash. At dawn, while fog still clung to the barracks, prisoners lined up for roll call, thin, hollow-eyed, exhausted, but forced to stand straight, eyes forward, never daring to look down. In the midst of them, nearly invisible in his ragged prison uniform, stood Janek Wolski, a Polish tailor from Łódź. Before the war, he had run a modest shop on Piotrowska Street, sewing suits for judges, actors, and minor clerks. Now, he stitched buttons onto the uniforms of the very men who murdered his people. Mauthausen, established in 1938 as a special camp for those the Nazis deemed irredeemably hostile, had by 1943 become one of the Reich's most brutal killing grounds. Here, prisoners weren't just destroyed, they were broken in spirit, stripped of dignity, turned into ghosts of themselves. Yet even in this abyss, cracks appeared, tiny openings where human will could still slip through. And Janek Wolski found his crack in a needle and thread. His assigned task was to mend and tailor uniforms for guards and SS officers. This was considered a privilege. Such prisoners received slightly more bread, avoided the infamous stares of death, and were beaten less often. But Janek saw no favor in this. He saw opportunity. He had begun to notice how officers scratched at collars, sleeves, and underarm seams, places where wool chafed against skin. In winter, it was dryness and cold. But in spring, as bodies sweated beneath heavy uniforms, even the smallest nick could fester, especially if something worse than dirt found its way inside. Janek wasn't a doctor, but his mother, a village healer, had taught him well. Rot begins not in the flesh, but in neglect, she'd say. He knew gangrene wasn't a myth. It was real, slow, relentless, and deadly. And if provoked in just the right spot.
In the workshop, escorted there each morning under guard, Janek had access to needles, thread, scissors, even a sliver of soap. But most importantly, he handled the officers' uniforms themselves. Men would bring in their tunics, complaining, "This seam itches," or "It's always damp under the arms." None suspected that behind an itchy stitch might lie death itself. He first tried it in March. An Untersturmführer, a junior officer from the Polish front, brought in his tunic. "Reinforce the cuffs, they're coming apart." Janek nodded, eyes down as a prisoner should, and set to work. But before threading the needle, he dragged it across the edge of his own prison blanket, the one he slept on, never washed, crusted with the filth of camp life, sweat, pus, decay, and bacteria hardened by starvation and cold. Then, inside the cuff lining, he made a tiny, nearly invisible cup, just enough to graze the skin when worn. 5 days later, the officer missed morning roll call. 7 days later, his tunic returned to the workshop to be reassigned to a new owner. Janek didn't smile. He didn't rejoice. He simply noted, "It works." From then on, he acted with method. He studied officers' habits. Those who sweated heavily got a subtle abrasion under the arms. Those who wore tight collars received a micro tear at the neckline. Those who scratched compulsively got thread laced with pus from the camp infirmary, disguised as an ordinary seam. He never repeated the same method twice. He varied his technique like an artist changing brushes.
By May 1943, 3 junior SS officers in Mauthausen had died of unexplained infection. Overworked camp doctors, already overwhelmed by typhus and dysentery, didn't investigate deeply. No autopsies were performed. The bodies were burned, like all the rest. No one connected the deaths to clothing. Why would they? The uniforms were clean, pressed, perfectly tailored, crafted by what the commandant once called one of Europe's finest tailors, unaware he was praising an assassin.
But Janek wasn't naive. Every stitch was a risk. If caught, he wouldn't just be hanged. He'd vanish. No name, no body, no trace he'd ever existed. So he moved with icy caution. Never more than 1 gift per week, never the same trick twice, never a word, not even in sleep. He knew his actions wouldn't win the war. He wouldn't save thousands, but every dead officer was 1 fewer executioner, 1 fewer voice ordering beatings, starvation, murder. And if he could take even 1, he had to. By June, Janek had become something of a legend among skilled prisoners, not because anyone knew the truth, but because he'd survived longer than most. His hands, though trembling from hunger, remained steady. His eyes, though dimmed by suffering, never lost their focus. And when he passed guards, they sometimes nodded, not out of respect, but because his work felt good against their skin. They had no idea each precise movement of his fingers was a prayer of vengeance. But everything changed in June. A new senior officer arrived, Hauptsturmführer Erich Böhme, a former Berlin surgeon reassigned to Mauthausen after a scandal involving illegal operations. Tall, with piercing eyes and the habit of noticing details, he inspected the workshop on his very first day, sniffing fabric, running fingers over seams. He said nothing, but Janek felt it. This man knew more than he let on. The next day, Böhme brought his tunic. "Alter the fit," he said in German, not looking at the prisoner, "and check all the seams for irritation. I won't tolerate scratching." Janek took the uniform, heart pounding. This wasn't just a request. It was a test. Maybe not conscious, but a test nonetheless. He did nothing to Böhme's tunic. He stitched it more perfectly than ever before. Even boiled his needle clean. When Böhme tried it on the next day and gave a silent nod of approval, Janek felt not relief, but dread. Because Böhme had stared at him too long, too intently. That night, Janek lay awake on his bunk, listening to the breathing of others, thinking, does he suspect? Or does he already know? He couldn't stop. Stopping would be surrender, but continuing meant death. Yet in his heart, there was no fear, only duty. Duty to those already gone, to the faces he'd last seen marching toward the gas chambers, to the woman he loved, taken to Auschwitz in the spring of 1942, to his father, shot for hiding a Jewish neighbor. If his life was the price for taking 1 more executioner from this earth, he would pay it. But as long as he drew breath, he would sow. June 28, 1943, Mauthausen concentration camp, Austria. Summer in Mauthausen was cruel, not just from the heat, but from what it unleashed. Bodies accustomed to cold and damp now wilted under the sun. Sweat, filth, and no water made skin raw and vulnerable. Wounds that healed slowly in winter now festered within hours. The infirmary lacked even rags for bandages. Prisoner doctors, barely deserving the title, worked by instinct, pulling medical knowledge from memory like roots torn from dry soil.
It was in this chaos that Janek found a new source, the infirmary itself. Gangrene, erysipelas, phlegmon, they flourished in barracks where men lay shoulder to shoulder, too weak even to turn away from another's moan. Janek couldn't enter openly, but he had a reason: mending bedding for orderlies. This granted him twice weekly access. He'd arrive with a sack of rags, needle in hand, and leave with something far more valuable: samples of pus, carefully wrapped in clean cloth, hidden in the double seams of his own tunic. He didn't take just anything. He chose carefully. Gas gangrene, caused by Clostridium perfringens, was his weapon of choice. It struck fast, especially in men whose immune systems were weakened not by hunger, but by excess, rich food, alcohol, exhaustion. Janek didn't learn this from textbooks, he saw it in the infirmary. First, mild discomfort, then fever, swelling, a foul stench, then blackened, dead flesh, all within 5 to 7 days, the perfect window, long enough for the victim to leave the camp, short enough to avoid suspicion. His method grew precise. No more dirty blankets. Now he'd apply pus directly to the inner seam, where fabric touched skin. He'd make a microscopic tear in the lining, just enough to cause a micro-abrasion with every arm movement or head turn. Not enough to bleed, just enough to let bacteria in. Then he'd secure the dose with thread soaked in camp soap mixed with pus. The soap masked the odor. The thread held the infection in place. Hauptsturmführer Bohm kept watching.
He never accused. He simply appeared in the workshop more often than others, asked odd questions. Do you know that Jew from Barrack 12? Can he sew too? Or, why did Untersturmführer Kretschmer break out in a rash after his tunic was repaired? Janek answered briefly, eyes down, voice flat. He knew any extra detail was a trap, any sign of knowledge, suspicion. Once, Bjorma left his leather belt in the workshop. "Sew the buckle," he said. "It chafes." Janek took it, nodded. Inside, he froze. Leather was an ideal breeding ground for bacteria. A single drop of pus hidden in the stitching. But he didn't do it. He sensed the trap. Bjorma hadn't worn that belt since arriving. Why now? No, he was testing. Janek stitched the buckle cleanly, washed his hands, returned it. Bjorma took it silently, fastened it, and walked away. The next day, Untersturmführer Haas died, officially of sepsis of unknown origin. Janek hadn't touched his uniform in 3 weeks. This wasn't his doing. Yet Bjorma came to the workshop and said, staring directly into Janek's eyes, "You sewed his sleeves in April, remember?" "Yes, sir." "What exactly did you do?" "Reinforced the cuffs. They were fraying." "Nothing else?" "No, sir." Bjorma held his gaze a long moment, then left. Janek knew his time was short. Still, he couldn't stop. Not now. Because just a week earlier, he'd been called to the camp office. A package had arrived from Auschwitz, addressed to him. Inside, a photograph. A woman in a striped prisoner's dress, pale, emaciated, but with the same eyes as in 1938 when they danced at her sister's wedding reception. Beneath it, a date, May 17th, 1943. A stamp, died of typhus. He knew it was a lie. Typhus killed faster, and she stood upright in the photo, meaning she was alive when it was taken. Murdered later, perhaps in the gas chambers, perhaps from exhaustion, but murdered.
From that day, every needle in his hand became vengeance. His next target, Obersturmführer Kraus, a cruel, drunken brute who loved beating prisoners with a club, especially those working too slow. He brought his tunic in. "Make the lining softer, it scratches like the devil." Janek nodded. He knew Kraus sweated heavily under the arms and rarely changed his shirt. The next day, Janek visited the infirmary. A young Lithuanian prisoner lay there, leg blackened by gas gangrene. He no longer spoke, only groaned. Janek approached, pretending to inspect bedding, and gently pressed a clean cloth to the open wound. Then he hid it in his sleeve. Back in the workshop, he slipped that cloth into the underarm seam of Kraus's tunic, a nearly invisible tear inside the lining. That was all. 3 days later, Kraus felt itching. 5 days, fever. 6, transferred to a hospital in Graz. 7, dead. Cause, anaerobic infection following trauma. Janek heard the announcement at morning roll call. His face didn't change, but inside, a cold wave of justice. Not joy, not triumph, simply balance. Yet that same day he was summoned, not to the workshop, but to Böhm's office. The room was clean, bookshelves, a map of Europe, a portrait of Hitler. Böhm sat in a white coat, not a uniform, still seeing himself as a physician. "Sit," he said, without looking up. Janek remained standing. Prisoners didn't sit in a German's presence. "Sit," Böhm repeated, softer. "It's an order." Janek lowered himself onto the edge of the chair. "You're a fine tailor," he said. "Better than in Berlin. I've examined your work. Stitches even, thread strong, lining like a second skin." He paused. "But I'm a doctor, and I know infections don't appear from thin air. They come from contact, from wounds, from filth." He looked straight at Janek. "Do you know gas gangrene can start from a scratch smaller than a pinprick, especially if anaerobic spores enter?" Janek said nothing. "You go to the infirmary, you touch open sores, you see how men die, and you understand how it's done." He stood, walked to the window. "I have no proof, but I have instinct, and it tells me you don't just sew, you kill." Janek didn't flinch. He knew to speak was to lose, to deny was to provoke. Silence was his shield.
"I could hand you over to a tribunal," Böhm continued. "But why? You're not the first to resist, nor the last. But I have a proposition." He turned. "Keep sewing, but only for those I name, and do it carefully, so no one knows but us." Janek went cold. Böhm didn't want to destroy him. He wanted to use him. "Why?" The word slipped out before he could stop it. Böhm smiled faintly. "Because I have enemies too, within the SS. Men who stand in my way. Men who despise medicine. You'll do what I cannot, and in return, I'll keep you alive, perhaps even transfer you to a camp with better conditions." Janek bowed his head. It was a trap within a trap. To agree was to become another killer's tool, To refuse death. He nodded. Very well, Bohm said. Tomorrow you'll receive a list. That night, Janek didn't sleep. He didn't think of death, but of corruption. How easily the clean becomes unclean. He had been an avenger, now a mercenary. But he made a decision. He would pretend to obey Bohm, but in truth, he would wait, and when the chance came, he would kill Bohm himself. Not with gangrene, not with a needle, but with something untraceable. He'd noticed Bohm's habit. Every evening, tea in his office, from the same porcelain cup, stirred by a silver spoon. And every evening, that cup was washed by the same prisoner, an old Frenchman, Monsieur Dupont, once a chef in Lyon, arrested for feeding refugees. He'd never spoken to him. But now, it was time.
August 19th, 1943. Mauthausen concentration camp, Austria. Autumn hadn't yet arrived, but in the hills above Mauthausen, its breath was already felt. Chill mornings, fog curling over the quarries, a deepening silence. The camp, usually roaring with shouts, barking dogs and clanging chains, now hummed with a different sound. Anticipation. The Red Army advanced. Mussolini had fallen in Italy. Even within Mauthausen's walls, where news was tightly controlled, the Reich's tremor was palpable. But for Janek Wolski, none of that mattered. His war raged inside the camp, silent, invisible, without explosions or fanfare. And now it entered its final phase. He began fulfilling Böhm's orders. 3 names in 1 month, all mid-level SS, Oberscharfers, Sturmführers, even a Gestapo man. Böhm called them careerists and soulless bureaucrats. Janek didn't know if it was truth or deception. Perhaps Böhm was eliminating rivals. Perhaps he truly hated the system but couldn't escape it. It didn't matter. Janek pretended to comply, but in truth, he left their uniforms flawless, clean, without a single scratch. Instead, he watched. He memorized Böhm's evening ritual. At 7 p.m., Monsieur Dupont brought tea, porcelain cup, silver spoon, sugar cube, hot water, and a sachet of herbal tea Böhm brought from Germany. No one inspected it. No prisoner would dare poison a German. But Janek knew. Poisoning was too obvious. Autopsy, investigation, torture, everything would unravel. He needed something slower, irreversible, unexplainable. He recalled a whisper in the infirmary. A Czech microbiologist, once imprisoned, had once told him, "There's a rare bacterium, Clostridium tetani, causes tetanus, enters through the tiniest wound, in a week, convulsions, in 2, death, and it always looks like an accident." Janek remembered. Tetanus, the iron death of ancient times. Farmers died from rusty nails. In the camp, almost never. It needed an anaerobic environment. But what if he created one? He prepared. First, soil. The campgrounds were paved with gravel or concrete, but beyond the vegetable patch, an old septic pit lay abandoned after a dysentery outbreak. In that muck, tetanus spores might survive.
Janek lost a needle while mending potato sacks, knelt briefly and scooped a clod into a rag hidden in his tunic lining. Next, a tool, not a needle, but the finest darning hook, almost needle-thin, with a tiny barb. Into it he pressed a speck of that soil. Then he boiled it, not to sterilize, but to kill everything except the spores. C. tetani spores survive boiling. Now, delivery. Boehm's porcelain cup sat on the windowsill while Dupont poured water. Janek had noticed a hairline crack in its base weeks ago. Boehm would never replace it. He clung to objects. That was his weakness. On the chosen day, Janek requested to repair sacks near the garden again. The guard, used to his obedience, agreed. At the right moment, he dropped his needle, turned his back, and in 10 seconds inserted the hook with soil into the crack, then snapped off the tip, leaving it embedded. From the outside, nothing visible. But each time Boehm drank, the spore would graze his lips. Yet Janek knew mucous membranes weren't ideal. He needed a micro-wound, and here habit helped. Boehm chewed the edge of his silver spoon when deep in thought. Over time, microscopic burrs formed, and if one carried a spore, he couldn't control it fully, but he'd done all he could. A week passed. Boehm seemed normal, inspecting work, asking questions. But then Janek noticed. The officer winced while drinking tea. Later, a slight twitch in the neck muscles. Janek recognized it from the infirmary. Early tetanus, jaw and neck stiffness. 3 more days, Boehm missed roll call. 5, transferred to a Vienna hospital with acute neurological symptoms. 10, dead. Cause, seizure due to unidentified infection. Janek felt no triumph. Tetanus was agony, body arching in spasm, jaws locked shut, consciousness intact until the end. This wasn't revenge. It was judgment.
But now he stood alone, without a protector, without cover, and burdened by a terrible thought. Had he killed not just a monster, but a man who, in his own twisted way, also hated the regime? A week later, a new workshop supervisor arrived, Untersturmführer Gruner, cruel, paranoid, known as an informant. He distrusted well-behaved prisoners. Immediately, he barred Janek from the infirmary, then refused to let him handle personal uniforms. Finally, he began interrogating other tailors. "What do you know about Volsky? Did he speak to you?" Janek understood. His turn had come. But he wouldn't die quietly. His final act wouldn't be for the camp or the Nazis, but for history, for those who might survive. He began sewing in secret. Not uniforms, not shirts, but tiny pouches, crafted from scraps, linings, anything he could steal. Into each he stitched a message, not on paper. There was none. He used his needle to prick the fabric in dots and dashes. Morse code, learned in the Lodge underground. Now it would preserve truth. The messages listed those he'd sent away, those who died in the infirmary, those who'd helped him unknowingly. He hid the pouches in quilted winter jackets made for guards.
Some jackets were sent to other camps, Dachau, Flossenburg, even Auschwitz. He prayed that just one pouch might reach the outside world. One night, he woke to noise. SS men entered the barracks. They called his name. He rose, smoothed his tunic, and took a last look around. On the bunk beside him lay a boy, 15, Dutch, snatched from an Amsterdam street. The boy stared at him in terror.
Yannick winked. The only time he ever did. They didn't take him to the gallows, not to a cell, but to the camp office. A young doctor with cold eyes sat waiting. On the desk lay Untersturmführer Grun's tunic. "You repaired this yesterday?" "Yes, sir." "Where?" "Under the arm. The seam had split." "Did you do anything else?" "No, sir." The doctor stood, stepped close. "Grun has gangrene. Started this morning, right where you sewed." Yannick said nothing. "We know it was you." Silence. "But we won't hang you. Tomorrow you'll go to the operating room. You'll watch as we amputate his arm, then as he dies from shock, and then we'll give you a needle, and you'll sew body bags until you drop." Yannick looked out the window. The moon, same as over Lutz in 1939. He didn't fear pain. He feared that his truth would vanish. But in his tunic pocket, stitched into a double seam, lay one last pouch with his name, the date, the place. He knew, if they killed him tomorrow, the note would remain in the uniform, and that uniform would go to another prisoner. And someday, perhaps someone would read it